all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandy Broadwell, and today we're diving into part 2 of the Goodreads Choice Awards predictions for 2025. So if you want to see part 1, I focused an entire video just on my fantasy predictions because that is the category that by far I have the most knowledge about. However, in this one, we're going to dive into all the other categories that I have opinions on. We're going to do a little bit of a dive into sci-fi, and then I'm just going to give some more general opinions on like 7 other categories, including romance and romantasy and historical fiction and things like that. So buckle up, we're going to dive in. So as you know, if you've been on the channel for a while, I consider myself to be a fantasy and sci-fi reader. However, the sci-fi category on Goodreads is a continual disappointment. And this year, I think, will be no exception. There are just not a whole lot of sci-fi writers getting hype right now. There is a handful, right? I think if you asked most general readers could probably name like Andy Weir and James S.A. Corey. Neither of those 2 authors have a book coming out this year. So who's left? You know, John Scalzi and Adrian Tchaikovsky are kind of tried and true. And they have books pretty much every year. So that's kind of a shoo-in. But other than that, the sci-fi category is often taken up by a lot of what people call cli-fi or literary science fiction, basically more dystopian leaning or climate dystopia sort of stories that definitely lean more on the literary side than on the like space opera-y fun sci-fi. So if you saw my fantasy predictions video from last week, I had like 24 different fantasy books that I talked about as potential contenders on the long list. I couldn't even come up with 10 sci-fi books that came out this year without doing a Google search. So I am going to talk about 10 different sci-fi books that I think are contenders this year, but this was a struggle. It was a struggle to think of 10. I did look up these books' number of ratings and average ratings on Goodreads before starting filming today for the sci-fi categories. I have these basically ranked on the screen in terms of most number of ratings to least number of ratings. So number 1 on this list is The Dream Hotel, which until I started Google searching on the internet, I did not even realize was a sci-fi book. I had heard of The Dream Hotel and I had heard readers talking about it, but I thought it was a horror book just based on like the cover of the book. I didn't realize that it wasn't horror. It is sci-fi, and I think it's like a dystopian sci-fi. So that was a surprise to me, and that is, of the books that I could think of, that is the most read sci-fi book 2025 release for this year with 26,000 ratings, which again, when we compare like the top book in romance, for instance, has like 500,000 ratings this year. The top book in fantasy has over 100,000 ratings. So the top book in sci-fi only having 26,000 ratings, I think that is the beacon you need to shout out that this category is not doing well. And I don't really understand why. I don't know why there aren't more sci-fi authors. I don't know why there aren't more sci-fi readers. That could be a whole nother video, so we won't get into it. But then the next 2 books drop down to 14,000 ratings, which is Death of the Author by Nnedi Okorafor and When the Moon Hits Your Eye by John Scalzi. Now, I did attempt to read Death of the Author by Nnedi Okorafor because I really enjoyed her Binti series, which was a novella. However, I found Death of the Author to be too depressing. I really liked the side story that was happening, the book within a book that was about robots, but the like literary aspect of it, the main storyline, was just really, really sad. And there's so much sad stuff that's happening in the world right now. I couldn't finish it. So that's not a great Not a great start. I have read one book by John Scalzi this year, which was Starter Villain, which was his release from last year. And I also only gave that book around 3 stars. It was cute and fun, but forgettable overall. Then we get to our Sci-Fi book that I've seen around a lot this year. And I remembered this one just because I do remember seeing the cover around a lot, which is All the Water in the World. That's my one on here. That's like the obvious Sci-Fi choice of the year. And that one has 8,800 ratings. Then the next one on here, which has around 6,000 ratings, is Automatic Noodle. However, Automatic Noodle is a novella, and I'm not positive whether or not Goodreads rates novellas or if it's only full-length novels that make it to the Goodreads Choice Awards. I can't remember. I think novellas are eligible because I think we've done Murderbot before in the Sci-Fi choices. But I could be wrong, so someone correct me if I'm wrong. But I think Automatic Noodle is like a cozy sci-fi about like robots that open a restaurant. So that actually sounds kind of cute. And then we have Adrian Tchaikovsky's big sci-fi release of the year, which was Shroud. And again, him and John Scalzi are really, they're holding down the fort for everyone. But that only has 5,700 ratings at this time. However, it is the highest rated book on this list with a 4.2 average rating. Most of these books have about a 3.6. Like pretty universally, all of these books have a 3.6. There's a couple 3.8s. Even All the Water in the World only has a 3.58, so that's pretty low. Then we have The Third Rule of Time Travel, which has around 4,100 ratings. Cold Eternity I put on here because S.A. Barnes is a sci-fi horror author, and I know that some of their previous books have been pretty popular. I haven't read any of S.A. Barnes, but I do love a good sci-fi horror, so I would like to give them a try at some point. But this one isn't rated particularly well. And then we have another Adrian Tchaikovsky book because he, of course, puts out like 3 or 4 books every year somehow. And this one I wouldn't expect to do as well because it's like the 3rd book in a series called Bee Speaker. Unfortunately, I think this is also going to hamstring his own ability to do well in the Choice Awards because his own readers might be split on which one to choose. Shroud definitely has the higher rating and more ratings, but there might be some Adrian Tchaikovsky fans that still like Bee Speaker better, and so that I'm not sure how Adrian Tchaikovsky is going to do this year. And then the only other book that I have read that I wanted to put on here for sci-fi new releases this year is All That We See or Seem by Ken Liu. Ken Liu is the author of The Dandelion Dynasty, which is a popular fantasy quartet. And I really, really liked The Dandelion Dynasty. So I was excited to see what Ken Liu was going to do with a sci-fi novel. However, I found this book to be pretty mediocre, just a standard kind of sci-fi thriller. I personally only gave it a 3, and it just came out in October, which is why it's outlined in red. I think even if this book turned out to be very popular and gained a really big following, it doesn't really have enough time to gain that following before the Goodreads Choice Awards. So even if for some reason it does make it to the long list, I don't think it'll be on the short list. Hey y'all, Editing Sandy here with a quick additional context that I wanted to give when I'm talking about sci-fi. First of all, I had a whole reading vlog last year where I tried to read some of the hits from the sci-fi Goodreads category. I will link that down below if you're interested in me talking about last year's sci-fi new releases. And also, I just wanted to mention that 2 of the biggest sci-fi series that are going on right now are not going to be featured in this year's Goodreads Choice Awards, but I would be remiss not to talk about them. The first being Dungeon Crawler Carl. This is a sci-fantasy, and I think there's good arguments for categorizing it as either fantasy or sci-fi, since Goodreads obviously doesn't have a sci-fantasy category. I personally think it belongs in sci-fi. However, there is not a Dungeon Crawler Carl book coming out in 2025, so it won't be featured. I think next year there is a good chance that we will see a Dungeon Crawler Carl book appear in the Goodreads Choice Awards for the very first time, which is really exciting because these books really just exploded in popularity over the last year or 2. And it's book 7, the most recent book that was published, which came out at the end of 2024, now has over 43,000 ratings, which is obviously
really, really great compared to all of the other sci-fi books that I'm talking about this year. And just for a book 7 of a series to have 43,000 readers is really, really great. So I think that book 8 coming out in 2026 is something to really look forward to potentially boost the sci-fi category. Secondly, I wanted to mention the Sun Eater series. The Sun Eater series is not nearly as popular as Dungeon Crawler Carl. Its 6th book, the most recent book that has come out, has almost 9,000 ratings on Goodreads. So still good for a sci-fi book. However, certainly not on the scale of Dungeon Crawler Carl. Its 7th and I believe final book is coming out in 2025. However, I think its release date right now is like November 18th. So it will have missed the cutoff by the time the Goodreads Choice Awards start this year. So I think that is definitely a worthy book to be in the sci-fi category. I don't think any of its previous releases have been included in the Goodreads Choice Awards, but this series is continuing to gain popularity and I think will go down in time as some of the most popular books from this year for this genre, but unfortunately they won't be included. I do think that next year has the potential to be a lot better for sci-fi because we are going to have a new Dungeon Crawler Carl book. We're going to have a new James S.A. Corey book. We're going to have a new Murderbot. So I do think that sci-fi Goodreads voting will actually have a little bit more oomph in 2026, and I'm very much looking forward to that.
So that's it for sci-fi. I can't say I'm super excited about any of these titles. Just based on number of ratings alone, the Dream Hotel should easily win, unless I'm just completely forgetting about a big sci-fi release that happened this year that I'm not aware of, and that is highly possible because like I said, I consider myself a sci-fi reader, but I've only read about 15 sci-fi books so far this year, 16 if I include the one I'm reading right now. So I have not really kept up with new releases, but part of that is just because none of the new releases have really grabbed my attention. If there are sci-fi books that I've forgotten about, please let me know down in the comments. I would love to know what your predictions are for the Goodreads Choice Awards. But let's dive into the other categories because we have a few more to cover. For the rest of them, I didn't dive as deep because I am not a reader of these categories in general. I just absorb I absorb the knowledge through the internet, through BookTube, through being a member of this community, and I hear so many people talk about so many other books. So for all the other categories that I feel like I have an opinion on, I'm just doing like a top 5 that I feel like these books should pretty solidly be on these categories because I'm not a reader of these books, but I heard so much about them, I feel like it's undeniable. They gotta be on there, right? So starting with Romantasy, my predictions are Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros, The Knight and the Moth by Rachel Gillig, Silver Elite by Danny Francis, Accomplice to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer, and this last one I'm less sure about because I think it just came out pretty recently, but I've been hearing a lot of good hype for The Second Death of Locke, and I think that's a Romantasy. So the first 4 I'm definitely confident are going to be on the Romantasy category. The Second Death of Locke, less sure, but I think that the people who are finding this book are really, really loving it. In the Romantasy category, I obviously predict that Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros is going to be the winner overall, even though I have no idea what the other things in that category are going to be, just because Fourth Wing is the book that created Romantasy as a category. So then let's talk about some horror. I actually have read a horror book, new release this year. So that one is Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix. I definitely think that this will be on there because Grady Hendrix is a pretty popular author and has had books on the Goodreads Choice Awards before. Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones, I'm pretty confident will be on there. Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zhang and The Possession of Alba Diaz are 2 books that I've just heard a lot of hype about this year. I'm pretty sure Isabel Cañas' other books have been on the Goodreads Choice Awards. I'm less certain about the Kylie Lee Baker book, but I think that one has some good hype around it, so I'm hopeful for it. And then of course, Stephen King's new release, Never Flinch, is obviously going to be the winner of the horror category. Stephen King always wins the horror category because he has a book that comes out every year and he's Stephen King. Then for romance, I'm just going with the authors I hear about over and over again, which are Emily Henry, Abby Jimenez, and Allie Hazelwood. Allie Hazelwood is splitting her own vote this year because she had 2 romance releases, Deepened and Problematic Summer Romance. Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry, I've heard, is actually a lot of people's least favorite of her books, or a lot of people were really disappointed with her release this year. However, she's Emily Henry and she wins every single year, so I'm not certain that having a less popular book will be enough to dethrone her from the Goodreads Choice Awards, but we'll see. Maybe Abby Jimenez has a chance this year with her release, which is Say You'll Remember Me. The other dark horse in here is First Time Caller. I don't think I had heard of B.K. Borison. Again, I'm not a romance reader. Maybe this is a very popular author, but I did hear a lot about First Time Caller this year, and I think that was striking a lot of people as a just really fantastic romance book. So congrats to B.K. Borison. You rose the level of my acknowledgement in this video, I guess, because I generally don't pay attention to romance novels, but that one's supposed to be really good. Then we have young adult category, and I don't follow young adult either. However, I know there are still lots of adults that read young adult. I don't really follow any young adults doing BookTube. So these are the young adult books that I think are popular with adults. That does not mean that these are the most popular young adult books for young adults. However, based on that, my predictions are Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins, which in my opinion, I think will be the winner of this category, just because The Hunger Games is such a phenomenon that it is, and I do think that a lot of adult readers who have nostalgia for The Hunger Games are still going back and continuing to read releases in this series, and so I think there will be a lot of adults voting in the young adult category this year for that reason. Rebel Witch is the sequel to that Heartless Hunter Crimson Moth book that came out last year that was super popular, so I definitely think that will be on the list. Oathbound, I know, is the final book of a very popular trilogy. Adrift in Currents, Clean and Clear. I mean, honestly, this is the one I feel a little bit less certain about because it's like the 14th book in this series by Shannon McGuire called The Wayward Children, but I know that this is a very, very popular series, so I have a feeling this one will maybe be on the long list. And then Rebecca Ross's new book, Wild Reverence. I just know that her, Heartless Vows, or no, I'm mixing up things. There was some book that she came out with a year or two ago that have vows in it. Divine Vows? Divine Rivals. Something like that. Anyway, Rebecca Ross has been making waves recently in the most recent years and has been on the Goodreads Choice Awards multiple times. So the fact that she has a new release out now, I'm sure, is getting a lot of attention. Just a plug in there for having a Rebecca Ross book in the young adult category. Those are the only categories that I had fully formed opinions about in terms of I can think of multiple books that I think should go in all of these categories. Other things like mystery thriller and general fiction and historical fiction and things like that, I really don't have much of an opinion on. However, I have 3 other books that I want to mention that I think I will definitely see on the Goodreads Choice Awards and doing very, very well. And that is Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I think this will be in the historical fiction category this year, and I think Kristen Hanna doesn't have a book that came out this year, so I think it's highly likely that Taylor Jenkins Reid is going to just sweep that category this year. I have no idea what any other historical fiction releases have been this year, but I just know TJR has the rabid fan base to just take over. Then I want to mention Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green, winning the nonfiction category as my prediction. Again, I don't keep up with nonfiction releases, but John Green is very popular. Everything is Tuberculosis was a really good read. It was a very short book that was easy to get through and I think has really mass appeal. So I think he's probably a shoo-in for winning nonfiction this year. And I did read both of those books. The other one I wanted to mention was Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaughey. I don't know if this will be in the mystery thriller category or the general fiction category, but I think it will do very, very well in whichever category it ends up being categorized in, just because I've heard a lot of different people talk about this book this year and how great it is. So that's all the most popular books that I personally could think of that I think are going to make the Goodreads Choice Awards this year. But I would love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are, what your predictions are for the People's Choice Award of books. And be sure to let me know down in the comments. I would especially love to hear if you have thoughts about the sci-fi category, but I would love to hear all of your predictions for the Goodreads Choice Awards. And they should be coming up any day now. So be sure to get your comments in and let's chat about it before the real list is revealed. Thanks so much for hanging out and tuning in for a little bit today. As always, please be kind, read more books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you again soon.